My name is Ethan Riley. The silence of this forest, Red Peak National Park, was supposed to be my cure. After Afghanistan, after serving as a first sergeant in the Green Berets, after countless missions where death breathed down my neck, I wasn't just looking for solitude. I was looking for control. Control over myself, over the memories, over this cursed PTSD that had become ingrained in me like the dust of Kandahar roads. Red Peak, a vast, almost untouched wilderness in the north, seemed like the ideal choice. Here, the only sounds were the wind in the ancient pines and the crunch of twigs under my boots. My army habits never left me. My movements remained precise, my observational skills honed to a razor's edge by the necessity of detecting disguised IEDs and enemy ambushes, now served to find traces of lost tourists or wild animals. Every morning, with the meticulousness of a career soldier, I performed routine tasks, checking the diesel generator at Northwatch Station, inventorying fuel and provisions, inspecting the perimeter. These rituals grounded me, returning an illusion of order to a world that had once shattered into a myriad of sharp fragments for me. Our team was small, like the crew of a ship lost in a boundless ocean. Alaya Navajo, the senior ranger, a woman in her 50s, with a face weathered by northern winds and eyes that mirrored all the hues of that ancient forest. She knew Red Peak like the back of her hand. Her pragmatism strangely coexisted with an almost superstitious reverence for the spirits of these lands, whispered about for centuries by her Navajo ancestors who lived here long before white men charted these mountains. Alaya was experienced, taciturn, and I respected her immensely. She always carried an old but impeccably maintained Winchester Model 94 30 caliber and handled it as confidently as an axe or a map. Ben Carter, the newcomer, was her complete opposite. Young, ambitious, with an ecology degree from a prestigious East Coast college. He saw this job merely as a stepping stone to a future career in the National Park Service. His self-confidence sometimes overflowed, but the guy was smart and quick on the uptake. He never parted with his new Garmin GPS device, constantly consulting it even when Alaya unerringly pointed the way using barely visible forest signs. And finally, Gus McCready, an old, perpetually grumbling veteran of the service, whose family had settled in these parts generations ago. Gus was a walking encyclopedia of local tales and eerie legends, which we mostly dismissed with a condescending chuckle. But sometimes when he spun stories about shadows gliding silently between the trees or strange, soul-chilling sounds echoing from the mountain peaks, something in his faded eyes made you genuinely uneasy. His cough, dry and hacking, seemed as ancient as the stories he spun around the evening campfire. The season was relentlessly nearing its end. The leaves on the trees had exchanged their emerald attire for fiery orange and gold, and then began to fall, blanketing the ground with a thick, rustling carpet. Few tourists remained. We were engaged in routine park closing procedures, checking remote trails, inventorying equipment at distant outposts that needed to be winterized, such as the cabin by Bear Creek or the watchtower on Eagle Bluff. Northwatch Station remained the only bastion of civilization for dozens of miles around. We meticulously checked the radio communication with park headquarters and the Iridium satellite phone. Everything was working normally, but the sense of isolation, thick and almost palpable, grew with each passing day. The forest seemed to hold its breath before a long, harsh winter slumber. The first unsettling sign came in mid-October. Alaya and I were on a routine patrol of the western sector, checking the condition of the Wolf's Fang Trail. The day was clear but cold, the air crisp and sharp as a freshly honed blade. And then we saw it. Or rather, what was left of it. A huge grizzly male weighing no less than 600 pounds lay in a small, sun-drenched clearing, torn apart with such inhuman, monstrous force that it took my breath away. I had seen many horrific sights in Afghanistan. The aftermath of explosions, remains after artillery barrages. But this was something different, something beyond my comprehension. The bear was literally ripped inside out. Its powerful leg bones and spine were snapped like gigantic matchsticks, some protruding from bloody shreds of flesh at completely unnatural angles, as if twisted by unknown monstrous vises. Huge chunks of hide and muscle were ripped out and scattered around within a 10-yard radius. There were no signs of a struggle typical of a fight with another bear or a wolf pack. Nor were there any traces of large-caliber bullets that could have inflicted such extensive damage. Only imprints of something enormous, with long, inhuman claws deeply embedded in the soft earth. Alaya, usually so imperturbable, stood beside me, her face ashen. She muttered something in Navajo, words I didn't understand, but her voice clearly held a primal, ancient terror. I took out my camera from my backpack and began to methodically photograph. Every wound, every track, every broken branch. I collected samples of hair, coarse, brown, but with strange, almost black streaks. Soil from the imprints. Scrapings from the bark of nearby trees where deep furrows, left as if by gigantic claws, were visible 7 or 8 feet high. The air was heavy, permeated with the metallic scent of blood and damp earth, with a barely perceptible nauseating note of something else, something putrid and utterly alien to this forest. Alaya made a brief report over the radio, trying to keep her voice steady and calm, though I saw her hands tremble. We exchanged a few words, discussing possible theories. Poachers with some exotic unknown weapon unlikely, given the nature of the injuries and the complete absence of vehicle tracks. An unknown, abnormally large predator, but what kind? A cougar? A wolf? Even the largest of them couldn't do this. A disease that caused the bear to go into a fit of insane rage, making it mutilate itself. This theory seemed even wilder and more implausible. I silently shook my head. My experience as a field medic told me unequivocally this was not the work of any animal known to science. That evening, a heavy, oppressive tension hung over the station. Gus, upon hearing of our discovery, darkened and began to recount a particularly gruesome tale about forest spirits that devour flesh and steal souls, about creatures his ancestors called Nagloshi, those who walk on 4 legs but are not beasts. Usually we dismiss his stories, but today his words sounded chillingly convincing. I noticed that the forest outside had plunged into an unnatural, oppressive silence. There were no usual night sounds, no hoot of an owl, no chirp of cicadas, no distant howl of coyotes, only the rustle of wind in the treetops, like a heavy, drawn-out sigh. Alaya, tight-lipped, walked around the station, meticulously checking the locks on the doors and the heavy wooden shutters on the windows. A habit that now seemed not an unnecessary precaution, but an essential necessity. Before going to sleep, as I was almost falling into a restless doze, the radio crackled sharply. It was Miles Harrington, the last registered solo hiker, an experienced backpacker who should have already reached the southern park boundary 40 miles from our station. His voice through the speaker was intermittent and strained despite desperate attempts to sound calm. Northwatch Station, this is Harrington, over. A little off course. Fog. I think I'm lost in the Black Gulch area. Everything's fine, but the GPS battery is dying. Planning to make camp and get my bearings in the morning. I'll make contact at 0900. Over and out. Black Gulch. Even the name itself sounded ominous. It was a place that even local hunters and trappers gave a wide berth. Alaya briefly replied, advising him not to move until dawn, to conserve phone battery, and to find better shelter. Harrington's voice, as he said goodbye, distinctly trembled. That night, I couldn't sleep for a long time, listening intently to the silence beyond the station's log walls. And that silence pressed on my nerves more than any scream. The echo of my military past mingled with the unsettling, ill-omened whispers of the forest, and this sinister combination boded ill. 9 a.m. the next day came and went, and the radio stubbornly remained silent. Miles Harrington didn't make contact. Alaya, strictly following National Park Service protocol, called him every 15 minutes. Miles Harrington, this is Northwatch Station, respond, over. In response, only silence. A profound, impenetrable silence, broken only by the static hiss of the airwaves. After an hour of fruitless attempts, Alaya placed the microphone on the table with a dull thud. Her face was as inscrutable as a rock carved from granite. "Let's move," she snapped, her voice brooking no argument. "Search and rescue operation. Ethan, you'll be our medic and tracker. Ben, you're on communications and general support. Gus, your local knowledge will be useful today." Gus grumbled something under his breath about wise people not willingly going into Black Gulch, especially when the forest was clearly in a bad mood, but he didn't argue and silently shuffled off for his gear. His advice was usually ignored, but now there wasn't a hint of his usual old man's grumbling in his words. There was unfeigned, deep-seated fear. We quickly checked and prepared our equipment. Detailed maps of the Black Gulch area, Silva liquid compasses, 2 GPS devices with new battery packs, several powerful maglite flashlights capable of cutting through the thickest darkness, radios with spare batteries. My large field first aid kit equipped with everything necessary, from bandages and antiseptics to powerful painkillers and an emergency tracheotomy kit, an old Army habit that had saved lives more than once. Signal flares, 3 red, 3 green. Weapons. Alaya had her trusty Winchester. Gus, an old but reliable Mossberg 512-gauge pump-action shotgun. Ben, an impressive-looking can of bear spray, which in the current situation seemed no more than a child's toy. I took my Service Smith & Wesson model 686-357 Magnum revolver and a Remington 870 shotgun loaded with double-aught buckshot. Something inside me told me that against whatever had so easily torn apart a 600-pound grizzly, pepper spray would be useless. We set off along Harrington's last presumed route, based on his words about Black Gulch. Autumn had fully taken hold. A thick carpet of fallen leaves rustled discontentedly underfoot, the air damp and piercingly cold. I walked first, carefully scanning the ground and tree trunks. My Army experience had taught me to notice the slightest details that stood out. An unnaturally broken branch, crushed grass, a barely visible imprint of a hiking boot. Here in this ancient primal forest, everything was different. The forest lived its own hidden life, full of myriad small, unnoticeable signs to the casual observer. But now I was looking for something else, something that defied the natural order of things. And I found it. Broken branches 8 or 9 feet high, as if something very tall and incredibly strong had crashed through the thicket. A complete, oppressive absence of birdsong. Even the ubiquitous squirrels and chipmunks had gone into hiding. And that strange, barely perceptible smell, like the one that hovered over the grizzly's remains. A heavy mix of damp earth, decaying leaves, rot, and something subtly metallic, alien. The weather began to deteriorate rapidly. The sun, which had barely pierced through the dense crowns of ancient trees, finally disappeared behind low, leaden-gray clouds. A cold, damp fog crept from the mountains, clinging to the tree trunks like ghostly, skeletal fingers. Visibility dropped to 20 or 30 yards. Ben nervously glanced around, his hand clutching the bear spray handle. Alaya walked silently, focused, her eyes narrowed, as if reading invisible forest signs. Gus trudged last, breathing heavily and occasionally spitting brown chewing tobacco onto the ground. After 3 hours of exhausting searching, we stumbled upon the first discovery. Harrington's abandoned backpack, bright blue, easily visible against the dreary brown leaves. It lay at the base of a huge, sprawling fir tree, its straps torn as if it had been ripped from his back with incredible inhuman force. His belongings were scattered around: a sleeping bag, a battered cooking pot, remnants of food. But the strangest thing, his wallet with cash and credit cards lay untouched, as did an expensive camera. This wasn't a robbery. His tent, pitched 20 yards from the backpack, was torn to shreds, clearly from the inside, as if someone or something had desperately tried to get out of it. There were no signs of a struggle around the tent, but on the trunks of nearby trees deep parallel scratches were visible, 3 or 4 horrific furrows, left by claws of such length and power that no known North American predator could have left them. They were too high, starting about 7 feet from the ground and extending upward. "What the hell?" Ben whispered, his face as pale as a sheet. Alaya silently ran her hand over one of the furrows, her fingers feeling the rough, scraped bark. "Not a bear," she said softly but firmly, "and not a cougar. This is something else." We moved on, delving deeper into the ominous silence of Black Gulch. The fog thickened, turning the forest into a surreal labyrinth of gray shadows and vague, frightening outlines. And then Gus, walking ahead of me, suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. He stared fixedly at the trunk of an ancient moss-covered spruce, his face expressing a mixture of unfeigned fear and some horrific recognition. Etched into the rough, cracked bark of the tree was a strange, unsettling symbol, a complex, intricate combination of spirals, broken lines, and dots, enclosed within an uneven circle. The symbol was old, covered in lichen, but undoubtedly man-made. "Signs," Gus rasped, his voice trembling. "My grandmother used to tell. These are the signs our ancestors carved to ward off them." "Who them, Gus?" Alaya asked, and there was no longer any hint of her former condescension in her voice. "Those who walk in another's skin, the Nagloshi. Those who steal another's form and devour the human soul." I took out my camera and took several pictures of the symbol, then another one discovered on a neighboring tree, and another. They were different, but a common, sinister alien style was clearly discernible in them. Alaya maintained her outward composure, but I saw her jaw tighten. She couldn't deny the antiquity of these marks. They weren't like primitive graffiti from lost tourists or loggers' tags. They emanated something primal and malevolent. As dusk fell, when the fog became almost impenetrable and the cold pierced to the bone, a howl echoed from the thicket. But it was not the howl of a wolf nor the roar of a bear. It was a piercing, soul-chilling sound, an inconceivable blend of agony, primal, insatiable hunger, and something horribly, inhumanly sentient. It rolled through the forest, reverberating many times off the rocks invisible in the fog, and died down somewhere in the deepest reaches of the ominous gulch. Ben let out a short yelp and pressed himself against the trunk of the nearest tree, his eyes wide with terror. Gus began to hastily mutter something like a prayer in Navajo, his hands visibly trembling. Even I, who had been through hellish scrapes and was accustomed to the sight of death, felt an unpleasant chill run down my spine. Alaya gripped her Winchester with such force that her knuckles turned white. "We're going back." Her voice was firm but unnaturally quiet. "Immediately. Continuing the search at night in this cursed place is pure suicide." The journey back to the station seemed twice as long and infinitely more dangerous. Every crunch of a dry branch underfoot, every rustle in the roadside bushes made us flinch and instinctively stop, straining to peer into the foggy, swirling gloom. The feeling of being watched by invisible eyes, of being methodically pursued, never left us for a second. This forest was no longer just wilderness. It had transformed into a hostile, living, evil-breathing entity, and we were in its very heart, small, defenseless, and vulnerable. The howl repeated, this time much closer, and in it, chilling notes of anticipation were now clearly audible. We reached Northwatch Station in deep, impenetrable dusk, exhausted to the limit and scared witless. The first thing we did was lock the massive front door with all its available bolts and lower the heavy wooden shutters on the windows. The sense of fragile, illusory security these log walls provided was deceptive. I understood that perfectly. But now, it was all we had between us and the primal terror that lurked in the forest. "Check everything," Alaya ordered, her voice strained but steady. "Windows, doors, attic, crawl space, no cracks left." Using my military experience in assessing defensive positions, I quickly identified the station's most vulnerable points. It was a small, single-story log building with several rooms, a kitchen, and a spacious storage area. The windows, even with shutters closed, presented the biggest problem. "We need to barricade the windows further," I told the others. "Use tables, cabinets, bunks, anything we can find. We need to create fields of fire. If they do try to get in, we need to know exactly where to shoot from and where to retreat inside the station if our defenses are breached." Ben, still pale as death, but somewhat recovered from the ordeal in the forest, silently nodded and began helping Alaya drag a heavy oak table to the main window in the common room. Gus, without a word, concentrated on loading his shotgun, his wrinkled, arthritic hands moving slowly but surprisingly steadily. I checked my revolver and shotgun, carefully arranging the remaining ammunition on the table so it would be easy to reach in the dark. Ammunition was depressingly scarce, much less than I would have liked in such a situation. We set up 2-hour shifts for watch. I volunteered for the first. The tension in the small, dimly lit common room, where only one kerosene lamp burned — we decided not to turn on the diesel generator yet to avoid attracting undue attention with noise and light — could literally be cut with a knife. Every rustle outside the walls, every creak of an old floorboard under someone's feet made my heart clench anxiously and sink into my boots. I tried several times to contact park headquarters on the radio, but received only a dead, malicious hiss, interspersed with strange, sharp clicks. The satellite phone was also treacherously silent. The display showed no signal. "They're jamming us," I stated with a heavy sigh. "Whoever they are, they know we're here, and they clearly don't want us calling for help." Alaya nodded grimly. Her face, in the flickering light of the kerosene lamp, seemed even more severe and drawn. My watch was almost over when it started. First, there was a dull, heavy thud against the wall from the forest side, so powerful that the glass in the unshuttered window frames rattled. Then another, and another. A sickening screech of claws on wood, as if someone was dragging a giant metal grater across the station's log walls. And a growl, low, guttural, full of primal bestial rage, but with the same frightening, soul-chilling notes of sentience as that terrifying howl in the forest. "They're here!" Ben screamed, leaping from his bunk, his eyes wide with terror. The attack was sudden, swift, and incredibly furious. Something huge, fast, and unbelievably strong assailed the station from all sides simultaneously. The heavy oak shutters groaned and buckled under powerful blows. The front door shuddered with every impact. Something violently battered a small kitchen window, which we hadn't had time to properly secure, tearing through the mosquito netting and ripping out the fragile wooden frame. "To arms!" I commanded, bringing my trusty Remington to my shoulder. Alea was already at the window with her Winchester at the ready. Gus positioned himself by the door with his shotgun, prepared to meet the unwelcome guests. Ben, initially paralyzed by animal fear, recovered and grabbed a heavy fire axe, his face contorted in a grimace of terror, but he stood on his feet, ready to defend himself. The kitchen window gave way first. With a deafening crack, the remaining frame shattered, and a huge, dark, coarse-furred paw with long, moonlight-glistening claws flashed through the opening. I fired, not aiming, just in the direction of the opening. A furious, pain-filled shriek erupted, and the paw instantly disappeared. But then a monstrous blow shook the front door. The thick pine planks splintered and cracked. "Hold the door!" Alaya cried, sending a shot from her Winchester into the narrow crack that had formed between the planks. The fight devolved into sheer chaos. We fired indiscriminately at the dark, fast-moving shadows outside the windows, at anything that tried to break in. The station shook with continuous impacts. The growls and shrieks from outside mingled with the deafening roar of our gunshots and our desperate yells. The air inside quickly filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder and something else, a repulsive, heavy, animalistic stench of the creatures besieging us. In one of the brief moments when I was frantically reloading my shotgun, one of the thick planks covering the window next to Ben shattered with a deafening crack. A huge, coarse-furred hand or paw, tipped with horrific 5-inch scythe-like claws, instantly darted inside and clamped onto Ben's forearm with a death grip. He screamed in unbearable pain and terror. The skin and muscles on his arm tore under the monstrous pressure like paper. Without a second's hesitation, I stepped forward and emptied the rest of my .357 Magnum into the vile creature, aiming for the limb's joint. A deafening roar, more like the death bellow of a wounded bull, erupted, and the paw unclenched, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as it had appeared. I dragged Ben away from the window. He was in deep shock, his arm a terrible bloody mess. The creatures outside, whether having sustained significant damage or deciding that a frontal assault wasn't yielding the desired results, suddenly retreated. The deafening thudding and furious growling subsided, leaving behind a ringing, oppressive silence and our heavy, ragged breaths. The station was severely damaged, but surprisingly, it held. Several windows were completely broken out, the front door held on literally by a thread and a couple of surviving hinges. Ammunition was practically depleted, especially buckshot for the shotguns. We were all in a state of deep shock, covered in dust, dirt, and cold sweat. I immediately tended to Ben's wound. It was horrific. A deep, jagged bite, with fragments of shattered bone visible in places. Arterial bleeding pulsed relentlessly, quickly staining the wooden floor dark red. I applied a tight tourniquet above the wound, cleaned it with the remaining antiseptic we had, and bandaged it tightly. Ben just moaned softly through gritted teeth, his face white as freshly fallen snow. The edges of the wound were uneven, ragged, and had already begun to blacken, as if from the action of some potent venom. Gus sat on the floor, leaning limply against the wall, his face an earthy, lifeless color. He stared fixedly at Ben's mutilated arm, and his faded eyes swam with a primal, animalistic terror. "That's it," he rasped, his voice barely audible. "They've marked him. They'll definitely come back for him. It always happens that way." "Who are they, Gus? What are these creatures, for God's sake?" Alaya almost screamed, her voice hoarse from strain and the terror she had endured. Gus slowly raised his bloodshot eyes to her. "These aren't just predators from the forest. The Red Peak forests are cursed, ancient lands, a prison for primal, merciless evil. My ancestors called them skinwalkers. But they're not werewolves from your Hollywood fairy tales and horror movies. Their curse is a terrible contagion, an infection. It spreads through saliva, through blood. It doesn't just turn a human into a beast. It twists their body inside out in an indescribably agonizing transformation, creating a grotesque, asymmetrical, nightmarish creature of broken bones, skin stretched to its limit, and an insatiable, all-consuming hunger. And the worst part, they retain a perverted, diabolical remnant of human intelligence. This makes them cunning, insidious, and more merciless than any animal, even the fiercest. They were once human. The silence that followed his words was heavier and more terrifying than any scream from the creatures lurking outside in the darkness. We shifted our gaze to Ben, who thrashed in delirium on his bunk, his body already starting to burn with rapidly rising fever. And at that moment, we all distinctly understood. The main, deadly threat was now not only outside, but also within our fragile, unreliable walls. Having grasped the soul-chilling truth hidden in Gus's words, Alaya made the hardest and most agonizing decision of her long ranger career. Her face, usually expressing calm, unwavering confidence, was now contorted with suffering, but her eyes held a cold, desperate resolve. "Ben must be immediately isolated," she said softly, but her voice was as firm as steel. She looked directly at me, and I understood that she saw no other way out of the situation. If Gus is right, then he poses a mortal danger to all of us. Ben, hearing his name, moaned and tried to lift himself from his bunk. His eyes were clouded by fever, but for a moment, a flicker of belated understanding and all-consuming horror appeared in them. "No, Alaya, Ethan, don't, please. I'm fine. I'll manage." His voice was weak, broken, and utterly unconvincing, but his condition spoke volumes. Alaya and I together moved him to a small, cramped storage room at the back of the station, where old, unused maps and camping gear were usually kept. The storage room had only one small window, barred with a strong metal grate near the ceiling. Ben protested desperately, pleaded, tried to resist as much as his mutilated arm and rapidly growing weakness allowed. It was agonizing to see him like that, helpless and doomed, but we locked the heavy oak door with a massive bolt from the outside. His desperate cries and dull thuds against the door echoed for a long time in the tense silence of the station. Ben's symptoms developed with truly frightening supernatural speed. His fever soared to 104 degrees Fahrenheit. He shook with violent, uncontrollable chills, despite all the blankets we had carefully covered him with. He began to hallucinate severely, shouting incoherent, fragmented phrases, names of people, plaintive pleas. The wound on his arm rapidly blackened, swelling to incredible, monstrous proportions. The skin around it became dry, parchment-like, and unnaturally stretched. A thick, dark, almost black fluid with a repulsive, sickeningly sweet smell of decay oozed from the jagged edges of the wound. His screams of unbearable pain became less and less human, gradually turning into a hoarse, guttural growl. As a professional medic, I observed this nightmarish process with soul-chilling horror and a kind of perverse, unhealthy professional interest through a small crack in the door, which we had thoughtfully left for ventilation. I made brief, fragmented notes in my field journal, recording temperature, pulse, the nature of changes in the wound, any behavioral anomalies. All of this went far beyond any known infection or injury. This was something utterly alien, unearthly, something that was rewriting the very essence of the human organism at a cellular level, transforming it into a monster. I desperately tried to systematize the meager information we had about the creatures that had so furiously attacked us last night. Their physical strength was simply incredible. They easily broke thick oak planks and tore out window frames with their fastenings. Their speed, they moved almost imperceptibly in the night darkness like ghosts. Night vision, there was no doubt about that. Resistance to ordinary firearms, my 357 Magnum bullets and buckshot from Alaya's and Gus's shotguns only enraged them, though they eventually forced them to retreat. A much larger caliber or precise aimed shots at vital vulnerable points, if these creatures even had any, were needed. And of course, the mode of transmission of this terrible infection, through saliva and blood, as Gus claimed. I remembered my Army courses on biological and chemical warfare defense, the strict quarantine protocols for sudden outbreaks of unknown exotic diseases. But here, everything was completely different. This was unlike any known virus or bacterium. This was a true ancient curse, embodied in monstrous flesh and insatiable blood. Fear and suspicion, like poisonous, choking ivy, quickly began to entwine our small, exhausted group. Each of us subconsciously feared for ourselves. Any scratch, no matter how minor, sustained during the chaotic night defense, any careless coughing fit, caused an uncontrollable wave of panic and mutual distrust. Who's next? Alaya tried her best to maintain some semblance of discipline and control over the situation, but her former confidence was severely shaken. The forest she had known and loved all her life had suddenly turned against her in the most monstrous and unpredictable way. Gus barely spoke, only mumbling something unintelligible in Navajo and occasionally furtively reaching for a flat metal flask of whiskey he had somehow managed to procure from his supplies. Again and again, with the desperation of the doomed, we checked all our available means of communication. The satellite phone, upon closer inspection, was not just without a signal. Its sturdy casing had cracked during the attack when one of the vile creatures had slammed something onto the table where it lay. The radio still remained treacherously silent, emitting only a malevolent, irritating hiss of static. We fired one signal flare, bright red, in the faint, almost ghostly hope that it would be seen from some distant outpost or from a randomly passing aircraft. But the sky was tightly overcast with low, gray, impenetrable clouds, and the flare, flashing brightly and soaring several hundred feet, disappeared without a trace, leaving no sign. It became definitively and irrevocably clear. No help was coming. We were completely alone in this cursed place. Gus, somewhat emboldened by the whiskey, reluctantly shared new, even more gruesome fragments of his people's ancient legends, about how his distant ancestors, powerful Navajo shamans, had fought the bloodthirsty skinwalkers for centuries, using the power of fire, the cleansing properties of silver, and special, complex ritual songs. About how these creatures were terrified of certain sacred symbols carved into stones or tree trunks, the very ones we had seen in Black Gulch. But his information was extremely contradictory, vague, and fragmentary. Some of the methods he mentioned only temporarily repelled the malevolent creatures. Others required human sacrifices or rare, exotic ingredients that we naturally did not have and could not obtain. "They don't like bright daylight," he mumbled, staring blankly ahead. "But cold moonlight makes them stronger and more aggressive. They're as cunning as the devil incarnate and can skillfully mimic human voices to lure an unwary victim into a deadly trap." His words made my blood run cold, and an unpleasant chill ran down my spine. Gradually, but inexorably, the full, horrifying realization of the true scale of the threat hanging over us dawned. The skinwalkers were, with soul-chilling probability, the very tourists who had vanished without a trace, about whom persistent, ominous rumors had circulated in the park for decades. Perhaps some of them were even former employees, mysteriously disappearing into these impenetrable forests years ago. There were many of them, incredibly many. They knew this terrain as well as Alaya herself, and they hunted not only to satisfy their monstrous, unnatural hunger, but also to further spread their chilling curse, to create more and more carriers. Ben's desperate, inhuman screams from the locked storage room grew louder and more bestial, and we understood with horror that one such carrier was rapidly maturing right next to us. Red Peak National Park had definitively transformed from a wildlife sanctuary into a sanctuary of primal, uncontrolled horror. I continued to observe Ben, gritting my teeth and desperately suppressing the nausea that rose in my throat. Through the narrow slit in the storage room door, each time risking being seen if what he was rapidly becoming still retained remnants of human sight. I meticulously documented every stage of his monstrous, indescribable metamorphosis. It was like watching a nightmarish nature documentary filmed in hell, where instead of a beautiful butterfly, something utterly indescribable and repulsive emerged from an ugly chrysalis, his body deformed with truly terrifying supernatural speed, joints twisted at completely unnatural, unthinkable angles, as if bones had temporarily become soft and pliable like warm wax, then instantly solidified in new, grotesque, deformed positions. The skin, blackened and covered with bleeding ulcers around the bite wound, stretched tightly over the rapidly changing skeleton, tearing in some places and forming strange, repulsive, leathery folds in others. The bones of his forearm, at the bite site, seemed to unnaturally lengthen and sharpen, rupturing the inflamed skin outwards like ugly, jagged spikes. From behind the door came the disgusting, sickening crunch of breaking and immediately fusing bones, the wet, squelching sound of tearing tissues, and his prolonged moans, which more and more resembled a low, guttural, bestial growl. I saw his fingernails on his healthy hand rapidly lengthen and thicken, transforming before my eyes into sharp, curved claws. It was a detailed, almost clinical, repulsive decomposition of the human form. Bodily horror in its most concentrated, vile manifestation. As a professional medic, I desperately tried to find some, however flimsy, logic in this madness, to grasp at some scientific explanation for what was happening. I hypothesized that the infection, as Gus called it, was acting at a cellular level, triggering an uncontrolled, chaotic process of rapid tissue growth and abnormal regeneration, but with monstrous, fatal genetic errors. It was like some incredibly aggressive form of cancer, but accelerated 1,000, if not 1,000,000 times, and purposefully directed at creating something utterly new, predatory, and merciless. It was some unknown ancient retrovirus, dormant in this isolated ecosystem for many millennia, or a previously unknown prion disease, mutated into something completely unimaginable and deadly. I made fragmented, incoherent notes in my field journal, hastily sketching the changes occurring in his limb structure, trying, like a military analyst, to understand the structure and possible weak points of a new, unknown enemy. But the more I observed, the less hope remained for any rational explanation. This was pure, concentrated evil in its primordial biological form. The incessant screams and furious growls emanating from Ben's locked room became a constant, oppressive backdrop to our existence, slowly but surely driving us mad. Alea retreated further and further into herself, almost ceasing to speak. Her extensive knowledge of the forest, her decades-honed survival instincts now seemed utterly useless against this new, supernatural threat. She sat motionless for hours by the window, staring intently at the hostile, impenetrable wall of trees, her face as inscrutable as a mask. Gus found an almost full bottle of cheap but potent Old Crow whiskey in the station's old supplies, and now regularly took pulls from it, alternating large gulps with quiet mumblings of ancient Navajo prayers and hoarse, furious curses directed at the unknown forest creatures. My own PTSD demons, the ghosts of bloody battles in Afghanistan, reawakened with new, redoubled force, finding a gruesome, frightening similarity between the sudden Taliban ambushes in the mountains and this invisible yet ubiquitous, deadly threat cunningly lurking in the impenetrable forest depths. Vivid, intrusive flashes of memory, the heart-wrenching screams of wounded comrades, the acrid smell of blood and gunpowder, painfully overlaid Ben's incessant growls and the soul-chilling screech of claws on the walls we had heard last night. During short, rare periods of lull, when the sounds from the storage room temporarily subsided, replaced only by heavy, ragged, hoarse breathing, Alaya and I made brief, extremely cautious forays around the station. No more than 20 or 30 yards from the building, always together, covering each other every second. We looked for fresh tracks, tried to estimate the approximate number of enemies, to understand their tactics and possible intentions. We found new, even more disturbing and incomprehensible symbols, crudely carved into tree trunks. They differed noticeably from those we had seen in Black Gulch, were fresher, larger, and even more sinister. Gus said these were their markings, signs designating their territory boundaries or warnings to other packs. Once we found a huge, almost human footprint of a bare foot, left on the damp earth, but its toes were unnaturally long and ended in clear imprints of sharp claws, and the heel was disproportionately wide and massive. The creatures were clearly patrolling the station's vicinity, keeping us under tight, continuous siege. Checking our remaining resources yielded extremely discouraging results. Food, canned goods, and Army MREs would last a maximum of 3 or 4 days with the most economical consumption. Clean drinking water in plastic jerry cans, also for a few days, no more. There was still enough diesel fuel for the generator, but we were terrified of running it, so as not to attract undue attention with noise and light. We had only about a dozen shotgun shells left for 2 guns, 2 last magazines for my revolver, and a little more for Alaya's Winchester. Medicines, especially powerful painkillers and antibiotics, were critically low. It became absolutely clear that we could not defend ourselves for long under such conditions. A decision had to be made urgently. Stay here at the station, effectively turning it into our mass grave, or desperately try to break through this forest hell to reach people. Sharp, furious arguments inevitably arose. Alaya, despite all the horror she had endured and the obvious danger, firmly insisted on an immediate breakout attempt. "I know these forests like the back of my hand," she said, her voice quiet but steely. "There are old, long-abandoned Indian trails here that few remember now. If we move fast and very carefully, we have a chance to reach the southern park boundary or at least an old logging road where we might be found." I was more inclined to fortify our current positions and try to hold out as long as possible, though I myself almost no longer believed that help would ever come. My years of military experience literally screamed that venturing into the unknown with such meager forces against such numerous and dangerous an enemy was pure, reckless suicide. "We don't even know how many of them are out there, Alaya. In the open, they'll just tear us to pieces in minutes." I tried to argue with her. Gus just grimly shook his head and resignedly repeated that we were all dead already, that no one had ever escaped the clutches of the bloodthirsty Nyaglashi alive. During one of our brief, risky forays for firewood, I involuntarily witnessed a scene that sent an unpleasant chill down my spine. Alaya and I were checking an old, dilapidated tool shed located about 50 yards from the station. Cautiously creeping along the dense forest edge, I suddenly noticed some movement among the trees. One of the creatures, tall, unnaturally hunched, covered in thick, dark fur, stood motionless by an old, half-ruined ranger's cabin that had been abandoned for years. It didn't move, just stared blankly at something lying on the ground at its feet. I cautiously raised my binoculars. The creature held a small, faded rag doll, the kind small children play with, in its huge, clawed, blood-caked paw. For one brief moment it froze, tilting its ugly, disproportionate head to the side, as if listening to something or painfully remembering something. Then, with a furious, guttural roar, it violently threw the unfortunate doll to the ground and disappeared into the dense thicket with heavy, clumsy leaps. This fleeting, distorted manifestation of something remotely resembling remnants of human memories made these creatures even more terrifying and dangerous. They weren't just mindless, bloodthirsty monsters. Deep inside them there were still tiny, mutilated fragments of who they once were, and that was the most horrifying and incomprehensible thing. After another long, sleepless night, filled with Ben's soul-chilling, bestial growls from the locked storage room and the agonizing, tense anticipation of a new attack, which, to our immense relief, never came, the overall tension in our small group reached its breaking point. In the morning, after a meager, joyless breakfast of cold canned goods and stale bread, Alaya stated firmly and decisively, "We're leaving. Tonight. Sitting here idly is voluntarily waiting for death. We have a chance, however slim, if we try to break through to the old, abandoned radio tower on Bear Ridge. It's about 15 miles southeast of here. If the equipment there still works by some miracle, we can call for help." Bear Ridge. I remembered the place well from old park maps. A tall, densely forested hill from whose summit there was indeed a good view for many miles around, but the path there led through dense, difficult, almost virgin forest, full of dangers. It's too risky, Alaya, I tried to argue. We have no idea what awaits us along the way. And what if the tower hasn't worked for a long time, or, even worse, is already occupied by them? And here certain agonizing death awaits us, Ethan. Her usually calm voice cracked into a shout. From hunger? From them? Or from what our poor Ben is rapidly becoming? We simply have no other choice. Understand that finally. Gus, to my considerable surprise, unexpectedly supported her. The old Navajo woman speaks sense this time. Sitting here doing nothing is like sheep in a pen meekly waiting for the wolf to come and slaughter them. On Bear Ridge, there are old, almost forgotten Indian trails there known only to the forest spirits and old mossy stumps like me. Maybe I can guide you, if we're lucky. His unexpected words instilled a faint, almost ghostly hope in our exhausted souls. The decision was made. We immediately began to feverishly prepare for the upcoming breakout. Alaya spread out a large, worn map of the area on the old wooden table and began meticulously charting the proposed route, marking particularly dangerous areas, possible shelters, and known water sources. I, in turn, focused on the tactical preparation of our small group. I explained in detail to Alaya and Gus how to move in a proper combat formation, a wedge when moving through relatively open terrain, single file on narrow forest trails. We assigned sectors of observation and fire, introduced a few simple hand signals to communicate without words if necessary. From the remaining diesel fuel and a few empty glass bottles, we hastily prepared several Molotov cocktails, primitive, but as practice shows, quite effective weapons against creatures that, according to Gus, were terrified of fire. We also meticulously sharpened axes and large hunting knives to razor sharpness. The hardest, most insoluble question remained Ben's fate. The sounds from the locked storage room became louder and utterly inhuman, furious, guttural growls, the screech of claws on wood, dull, powerful thuds, as if he was beating against the walls with immense force, testing their strength. Taking what he was rapidly becoming with us was utterly unthinkable. It would be tantamount to collective suicide. Leaving him locked here meant condemning him to a slow, agonizing death by hunger and thirst, and even worse, voluntarily giving the enemy another strong, bloodthirsty fighter when he fully transformed and inevitably broke free from his confinement. In the evening, as we were finishing our last preparations for the night departure, Ben's voice unexpectedly came from the storage room. Surprisingly clear, almost normal, though very weak and strained. "Ethan, Alaya, are you there?" We silently approached the door. "Ben, how are you feeling?" Alaya asked, her voice trembling noticeably. "Bad. Very, very bad. It's already inside me. I can distinctly feel it changing me from within. Please, don't let me become one of them. I beg you, kill me while I'm still me, before it's too late." His words were like a strong, unexpected blow to the gut. Alaya recoiled from the door, frantically covering her mouth with her hand to keep from screaming. I felt a heavy, choking lump rise in my throat. This was no longer the young, ambitious, self-confident newcomer we had known. This was an exhausted human soul, trapped in a death trap of a rapidly transforming, monstrous body, desperately pleading for one last terrible act of mercy. After a long, painful, oppressive silence, I looked at Alaya, then at Gus. In their bloodshot, despairing eyes, I saw the same terrible, unbearable decision that had already ripened in my own soul. "We can't, Ben. We won't be able to," Alaya began. but her voice broke and trailed off mid-sentence. "You must!" His voice suddenly became hoarse again, rough, with distinct low, bestial notes. "Quickly, before it's too late, for all of you." I slowly drew my revolver from its holster. My hands trembled treacherously. This was incomparably worse than any, even the bloodiest battle. I looked at Alaya again. She nodded silently, turning her face to the wall, silent tears streaming down her cheeks. Gus, hastily, awkwardly made the sign of the cross. I pressed the cold barrel of my revolver to the keyhole, through which a faint, dim ray of light from the common room sometimes shone. "Forgive us, Ben," I whispered barely audibly and forcefully pulled the trigger. The deafening roar of the gunshot in the confined space of the small station momentarily deafened us. No sound came from the storage room anymore. The silence that fell after the shot was even more terrifying and unbearable than his inhuman screams. We had committed an act of mercy killing, and this terrible, unbearable burden settled on our souls like an indelible, bloody stain. Gus, trying to distract us from our grim, oppressive thoughts, began to share new, previously unknown details from his people's ancient legends. He pointed out several specific locations on the old map that he said skinwalkers always carefully avoided. These were ancient Indian burial grounds and so-called power spots, marked by special stone circles. He also told us that these creatures were especially active and aggressive during new moon and full moon periods, and the new moon was fast approaching, making them even more dangerous and unpredictable. Just before we left, he gave me a small, tightly tied leather pouch. "This is dried bitter wormwood and ground bear root. My late grandmother always said the Naglashi can't stand this smell. Carry it with you always. It might help." I skeptically turned the dubious pouch over in my hands, but dutifully slipped it into my jacket's inner pocket. In such a desperate situation, you'd cling to any straw, no matter how faint. We quickly packed our modest backpacks, taking only the essentials: weapons, the few remaining ammunition, a little food, mostly high-calorie energy bars and jerky water flasks, a small first aid kit, a map of the area, a compass, and flashlights. I insisted on maximum lightness and mobility. Every extra pound of gear could cost us our lives in this deadly trek. Just before leaving, as impenetrable inky darkness already thickened outside the station windows, I gathered Alaya and Gus in the common room. "Listen to me very carefully." My voice was quiet but firm, like a briefing before a critical military operation. We go all together, in a tight group, staying as close as possible to each other. No one falls behind, no one tries to be a lone hero. Alaya leads. Gus brings up the rear, and I'll be in the middle covering the flanks. If we run into them, don't panic, stay calm. Open fire only on my command, or in case of a direct, immediate threat to life. Conserve every bullet. Our main and only goal is to survive and reach the radio tower. Is everyone clear? They silently nodded in agreement. In their despairing eyes, I read a volatile mix of animal fear, all-consuming desperation, and a faint, almost extinguished hope for salvation. To check the situation immediately before departure, I made a short, extremely risky sortie. I quietly slipped out through the back door, which we had hastily repaired, and quickly circled the station's perimeter, pressing close to the cold log walls, trying to move silently, like a shadow. The forest around was eerily quiet, too quiet. Not a sound, except for the barely audible rustle of my own boots on the fallen autumn leaves. This unnatural, dead silence was especially ominous and frightening. I returned a few minutes later, my heart pounding in my chest. "Clear," I reported briefly. "But that means absolutely nothing." They could be anywhere, waiting for us in any ambush. We cautiously opened the front door, and one by one stepped into the cold, hostile, impenetrable darkness of Red Peak. Our last line of defense had been abandoned. Now, only forward, through teeth and claws, towards the unknown. We left Northwatch Station silently, like ghosts, instantly dissolving into the thick, inky darkness of the moonless night. The dense, cold fog, which had not dispersed throughout the day, was simultaneously our ally and our worst enemy. It reliably concealed us from prying eyes, but at the same time significantly hampered our view of what lurked ahead, around the next bend in the trail. Alaya confidently led us forward, unerringly navigating by signs known only to her. The smooth curve of a frozen stream, the whimsical shape of a lone rock barely discernible in the foggy haze, the specific, characteristic slant of an ancient, mighty pine. Gus, breathing heavily and stopping periodically to catch his breath, brought up the rear of our small, exhausted group, his old, battered shotgun always at the ready. I walked in the center of our improvised column, continuously scanning the flanks and rear, my trusty Remington 870 feeling like a natural extension of my arms. The first few miles were incredibly difficult. The tension was almost physically palpable. Every muscle in my body was cramped with the constant, agonizing anticipation of a sudden attack. We moved very slowly and with extreme caution, trying not to make the slightest unnecessary noise. But the dry, fallen leaves and small branches underfoot treacherously crunched, and the sound echoed loudly in the dead, oppressive silence of the night forest. Less than an hour passed before they found us. We were just crossing a small clearing overgrown with tall grass when a dark, swift, blurry shadow darted out of the thick fog to our left. Another followed instantly, and another. Skinwalkers. They moved with incredible supernatural speed, almost completely silently, their sinister, grotesque silhouettes barely discernible in the swirling fog. "Contact left!" I shouted loudly, instantly bringing my shotgun to my shoulder. The first creature, huge, hunched, with long, disproportionate limbs swinging from side to side, was no more than 10 yards from us. I fired a double shot, not aiming. The heavy buckshot slammed into its broad chest, throwing it back several steps with a furious, pain-filled shriek. Alaya instantly turned, and with a precise shot from her Winchester, put a bullet into the second monster, aiming straight for its head. Gus opened rapid fire from his shotgun on the third creature, which was trying to outflank us from the right with incredible agility. A short, furious, chaotic skirmish ensued. We desperately fired back, slowly retreating to the nearest thick trees to prevent these creatures from surrounding us. The acrid smell of gunpowder mingled with their repulsive, sickening, animalistic stench. One of the creatures, particularly large and aggressive, charged Gus, but Alaya reacted in time, and her accurate shot brought the malevolent monster down at the terrified old man's feet. "Move fast now!" Alaya commanded loudly, and we, continuing to fire on the run, dashed headlong into the dense forest thicket, desperately trying to shake off our relentless pursuers. For several long, agonizing minutes, we ran without looking back until we were completely exhausted and collapsed to the ground. It seemed we had managed to throw them off our trail, at least for a while. Alaya again led us onward, but the forest seemed to openly mock us. Trails she had known since childhood unexpectedly turned out to be blocked by impassable fallen trees. Small forest streams inexplicably changed their course, and familiar landmarks mysteriously disappeared in the thick fog or looked completely different than before. The skinwalkers, it seemed to us, were openly playing with us, like a merciless cat with a captured mouse. purposefully driving us deeper and deeper into completely unknown, ominous, infamous corners of this cursed park. The impenetrable fog and the deathly night darkness turned our already difficult journey into a true, utter hell. We got trapped several times in dead ends, unexpectedly encountering high, sheer, impassable cliffs or foul-smelling, sucking bogs, and we had to turn back, losing precious time and our last reserves of strength. It was in one of these treacherous traps that we lost poor Gus. We were painstakingly crossing a narrow gorge, choked with huge, slippery rocks, when from above, from both sides simultaneously, sharp stones rained down on us. And then on the edge of the gorge they appeared, 3 or 4 dark, ominous silhouettes against the barely lightening pre-dawn sky. We were caught in a death trap. "Back! Quickly back!" I desperately shouted, but it was already too late. One of the skinwalkers, particularly large and fierce, leapt from a ledge directly in front of Gus with one giant bound, completely cutting off his escape route. The old man didn't lose his nerve. He coolly emptied his shotgun directly into the vile creature's hideous face, but it only roared furiously and deafeningly, knocking the weapon from his hands with one powerful blow, then lunged at him. Gus tossed aside the now useless shotgun and drew his large, worn hunting knife from its sheath. "Go, quick, I'll hold them off," he rasped, bravely lunging to intercept the other creatures that were already approaching Alaya and me. I saw him forcefully plunge his knife into the thick furred side of one of the monsters, and how another immediately clamped its death grip onto his shoulder. That was the last thing I managed to see. Alaya grabbed my hand forcefully and pulled me away with all her might up the steep, crumbling slope under a hail of sharp stones and the furious, soul-chilling roars of the skinwalkers. Gus's desperate cries, full of unbearable pain and rage, haunted us for a long time, echoing in the gorge until they abruptly ceased mid-scream. When we finally escaped that cursed gorge, Alaya collapsed to the ground, shaking with silent sobs. I stood beside her, helplessly clenching my fists until my knuckles hurt, feeling like the ultimate coward and traitor. Gus had sacrificed his life for us. Before we began that ill-fated, deadly crossing, he had discreetly slipped his old, well-worn map into my hand, on which his trembling hand had penciled some additional incomprehensible markings, and that same small leather pouch with dried herbs. "If anything happens to me, son," he had said then in a quiet, serious voice, "this might be useful to you. Here, I've marked their main dens and lairs." His tragic death was not just the loss of a loyal comrade and experienced guide for us. It was a devastating, crushing blow to our already low, depressed morale. We continued our desperate journey with our last strength, now only 2 of us. Alaya, having with great difficulty suppressed her grief and despair, again took on the difficult role of guide. We used the few primitive tactical tricks we could improvise on the fly. I set up simple tripwires made of strong fishing line, attaching empty tin cans to them to create extra noise and distract our pursuers if they came after us. In one particularly narrow passage between rocks, we with great difficulty brought down several large, precariously balanced boulders to at least somewhat block their path. Once, when the pursuit became especially obvious and persistent, we distinctly heard their malevolent growls and heavy breathing very close, literally right behind us. We set fire to a small area of dry, highly flammable bushes, using one of our last remaining Molotov cocktails. The bright flames and thick, acrid smoke, as the late Gus had said, forced them to retreat for a while, giving us a small but much-needed respite. But the relentless pursuit never let up. The skinwalkers were incredibly persistent and tireless hunters. They constantly, unrelentingly hung on our heels, set cunning ambushes in the most unexpected and dangerous places, tried to separate us, purposefully driving us into narrow, impassable passages or towards high, sheer cliffs. Their perverted diabolical intelligence and their thorough supernatural knowledge of this terrain gave them a huge, undeniable advantage. We engaged in short, fierce firefights several times, each time losing precious, golden-worth ammunition. In one such skirmish, I received a deep, painful scratch on my arm from the razor-sharp claws of one of them when it unexpectedly tried to grab me from behind a thick tree. Alaya immediately treated my wound with the remaining antiseptic, but the soul-chilling fear of possible infection settled within me like a cold, venomous snake. By dawn, utterly exhausted, starving, and freezing, we finally saw it. The tall, rusty, leaning old radio tower on the very summit of Bear Ridge. It stuck out of the ground like an ugly, rusted needle, piercing the gray, cheerless, pre-dawn sky. A faint, almost extinguished hope for salvation flared up in our weary hearts with new, unexpected force. But when we, with incredible effort, overcame the last, particularly steep ascent, and finally reached the small, overgrown clearing at the very base of the tower, a cruel, crushing disappointment awaited us. The small, squat brick building that once housed the transmitting equipment was completely destroyed. The roof had collapsed, the walls had partially crumbled, exposing rusted rebar remnants. And the metal tower itself was severely bent and monstrously twisted, as if a giant, inhuman hand had carelessly crumpled it like an empty tin can. On the remnants of the collapsed walls were the same ominous ritualistic symbols as in Black Gulch. There was no connection here, nor could there be. This was either another cunning trap set by these creatures, or simply further undeniable proof that we were forever trapped in this cursed primal hell. We collapsed powerlessly onto the cold, damp ground beside the ruins, feeling utterly crushed, depleted, and doomed. This was only a brief, illusory respite in the face of a new, even more terrifying and inevitable unknown. After a short, uneasy respite filled with foreboding at the grim ruins of the abandoned radio tower, Alaya and I soberly assessed our truly deplorable, desperate situation. We had almost no ammunition left. 3 last rounds for my revolver and 2 for my shotgun, and Alaya had 4 for her trusty Winchester. Food was virtually non-existent, 1 last stale energy bar each. Our water flasks had long been empty. Alaya looked absolutely terrible. Her face was severely drawn and gaunt. Deep, dark circles lay beneath her eyes, and on her left shoulder, where one of the vile creatures had indeed severely clawed her during our last desperate skirmish, a large, ugly, dark brown stain of congealed blood spread across her jacket. She desperately tried to hide it from me, but I noticed her wincing in unbearable pain with every careless movement. The soul-chilling fear that she too was infected clutched my heart in cold, merciless, vice-like grip. If it were true, I would be utterly alone in this hell. It was then, when an all-consuming, bleak despair began to completely overcome us, that we noticed it. We had taken cover in the half-ruined, debris-filled building of the former radio station, trying to rest and warm ourselves by a barely smoldering fire, when one of these creatures slowly emerged from the dense undergrowth at the very edge of the clearing, not bothering to hide. It was strikingly different from the others we had seen. It was significantly larger, more massive. Its thick, matted fur was almost inky black, and its eyes glowed in the dim light of the ruins with an ominous, malevolent red fire. It moved slowly, heavily, but with incredible confidence, like the true master of these cursed lands, and the other skinwalkers who followed it. There were at least 5 of them respectfully kept their distance, as if awaiting its commands or instructions in fear. It let out a low, guttural, vibrating growl, and the other creatures instantly froze, as if on command, turning their ugly, disproportionate heads towards it. "Alpha," Alaya whispered faintly, her voice almost inaudible over the sound of the wind. "That's their leader, the pack leader." I knew she was absolutely right. This creature clearly and undeniably led the others. It was one of the very first infected, or one who for some reason possessed some special supernatural abilities that made it significantly stronger, cunning, and more dangerous than the others. And at that very moment, something sharply clicked inside me, shifted. Passive, exhausting defense, desperate, hopeless flight, all of it led only to an inevitable, agonizing postponement of the unavoidable end. To survive, we had to deliver a counter, crushing blow. Destroy the leader, and then the pack would break up on its own, or at least significantly weaken and lose its organization. "Alaya," I said, trying my best to keep my voice firm and confident, though inside I was trembling with fear and tension. "I have a plan. Very risky, practically suicidal, but it's our only last chance for salvation." I quickly, disjointedly explained my desperate idea. To use the last Molotov cocktails we had and the obvious fact that the Alpha was too overconfident and didn't expect active resistance from us. To lure it and its entire entourage into an elaborate trap here, in these gloomy ruins, where the narrow, debris-filled passages and half-ruined, unstable walls could give us some tactical advantage. We could effectively use the element of surprise and the all-consuming power of fire. Alaya listened to me silently, not interrupting, her tense gaze fixed on my face. When I finished, she was silent for a long time, pondering intensely, then slowly, heavily nodded. "All right, Ethan, I'm with you. My decades of knowing this forest have proven utterly useless here. Now all our hope rests on your rich combat experience." In her voice, there was not only cold, desperate resolve, but also a new, previously unknown, searing strength. She perfectly understood that this would be our last, decisive battle. I fought with all my might against the surging, agonizing flashbacks from my Afghan past, sudden ambushes, deafening explosions, the heart-wrenching screams of wounded and dying comrades. But now, this terrible, bloody experience, which I had so long and desperately tried to forget, was our only last weapon in this unequal fight. We quickly, feverishly prepared for our last, decisive battle. We chose the most suitable place for an ambush, a narrow passage between 2 crumbling, ready-to-collapse walls, choked with brick and concrete debris, leading to a small, enclosed courtyard of the ruined building. There, we could quickly and effectively block the only exit and create a true fire trap for our enemies. I hastily prepared the last 2 Molotov cocktails. Alaya prepared another, the most powerful and destructive, with the addition of used engine oil, which we miraculously found in an old rusty jerry can nearby. We clearly distributed roles. I was to provoke them and lure them into the trap. Alaya was to ignite the main, most powerful cocktail in time, once they were in the very center of the courtyard. We tacitly, without extra words, said goodbye to each other, simply meeting each other's gaze for a moment. Words were not needed at such a time. I picked up a heavy stone from the ground and, cautiously leaning out from behind the corner of the half-ruined wall, threw it with force towards the Alpha. aiming for one of its closest lieutenants. The stone hit the vile creature squarely on the leg. It howled in pain and surprise. The Alpha sharply turned its massive, grotesque head towards us, its bloodshot red eyes gleaming maliciously in the dim light. I dashed out into the open, well-exposed area, demonstratively fired my shotgun into the air, and then, without delay, rushed back into the narrow passage between the walls. "Come here, you vile freaks. Come on, try to get me if you can," I shouted loudly, provocatively, trying my best to make my voice sound as defiant and mocking as possible. My risky gamble paid off completely. The Alpha, letting out a furious, deafening roar, was the first to give chase, followed headlong by its other henchmen. They charged at me like a pack of wolves maddened by hunger and rage, their long, sharp claws screeching disgustingly against the stones and concrete. I ran without looking back with all my remaining strength, knowing for sure that Alea was waiting for me at the agreed spot, ready for action. When I, with a final surge of willpower, dashed past the predetermined point, I shouted loudly, with all my might, "Now, Alea, go!" Without hesitation, she hurled her homemade incendiary device directly into the thick of the pursuing monsters. The glass bottle shattered with a deafening clang, and the small inner courtyard instantly transformed into a true, roaring inferno. Bright, blinding flames roared several feet high, instantly engulfing the creatures thrashing in panic. Monstrous, inhuman, soul-chilling screams of unbearable pain and primal rage erupted. I sharply turned and with all my strength threw my 2 remaining cocktails at the edges of the fiery ring, thereby cutting off their last escape routes. But the Alpha was not as simple as we had expected. Shrouded in plumes of black, acrid smoke and tongues of flame, it burst from the deadly, fiery ring with a deafening, furious roar and leaped directly at me in one gigantic bound. Its thick, black fur smoked and charred, its skin covered in disgusting blisters, but it was still alive and incredibly, mortally dangerous. I only managed to fire my revolver once. The bullet struck its massive shoulder, but it seemed only to further enrage the already maddened monster. It knocked me off my feet with one powerful blow of its clawed body. Its huge, blood-caked paw crashed down with incredible force onto my right shoulder. I felt a sharp, unbearable, piercing pain, the deafening crunch of breaking bones, and the world around me momentarily darkened, drowning in a crimson fog. The last thing I vaguely remembered before completely losing consciousness was Alaya, clutching a bloodied axe, lunging at the burning, roaring monster with a desperate, furious scream, her face distorted by terror and hatred. Time for me was measured in hours, if not minutes. I distinctly felt the vile creature's hot, poisonous saliva penetrate deep into my open wound, and the cold, clammy horror of realizing that I, too, was now infected was stronger than any, even the most unbearable physical pain. Consciousness returned to me slowly, in agonizing, broken surges, breaking through a thick, viscous veil of unbearable pain and rising nausea. I lay on the cold, damp, ash-covered ground. The air smelled sharply of acrid smoke, burnt fur, and fresh, not yet congealed blood. The first thing I dimly saw, opening my eyes with immense effort, was the low, gray, overcast, pre-dawn sky, covered with ragged, leaden clouds. Then I saw Alaya. She sat beside me, leaning limply against the cold, half-ruined brick wall, her face entirely covered in soot, dirt, and congealed blood, her clothes ripped to shreds. In her weakened hand, she still clutched the heavy fire axe, its blade dark brown with blood. "Ethan, you're finally awake." Her voice was very weak, barely audible. but I distinctly heard genuine, heartfelt relief in it. I tried with great difficulty to sit up, but a sharp, piercing pain in my right shoulder made me groan loudly and collapse back to the ground. My shoulder was dislocated, and the deep, jagged wound from the Alpha's razor-sharp claws pulsed relentlessly, sending scorching waves of unbearable heat throughout my exhausted body. Alpha, where is it now? I managed to croak, choking on a cough. Alaya silently nodded towards the ugly, charred remains lying a few yards from us. Dead? I finally finished it off with the axe. The others, most of them either burned alive in the fire or scattered in a panic when their leader fell. A Pyrrhic victory. We had destroyed the Alpha and most of its bloodthirsty pack, but at what unimaginable monstrous cost? I looked at Alaya. Her left shoulder, where one of the vile creatures had indeed severely clawed her during our last desperate fight, was clumsily bandaged with a piece of my own torn shirt, but the makeshift bandage was already soaked through with dark, thick blood. She too was wounded, and possibly infected. The site of our last decisive battle looked like a true branch of hell on earth. Ugly breaches gaped in the walls everywhere, the ground was scorched black, and the air hung with the sickening, suffocating stench of decaying, charred skinwalker remains. I looked at my own wound with horror. Its edges had already begun to blacken and swell rapidly, exactly like poor Ben's. The skinwalker's venom acted incredibly fast, spreading through my body with alarming speed. I distinctly felt the fever beginning to envelop my entire body, how an uncontrollable, chilling shiver ran through my skin, despite the still smoldering embers of our improvised campfire around us. I was infected. This was the end. My end. Alaya, I stammered with great difficulty. My wound. You know perfectly well what this means. She looked at me, and in her tear-filled eyes, I saw the same unbearable torment and despair as when we had made that terrible forced decision about Ben's fate. "We will definitely get out of here, Ethan," she said in a trembling voice, but there was no longer any hint of her former confidence. "We just have to get out." But I already knew the cruel truth. I distinctly, on a physical level, felt an unknown, alien, hostile force rapidly and irreversibly reshaping my body from within. My bones ached unbearably. My muscles cramped painfully. Strange, frightening, bloody images began to flash in my inflamed head, and a primal, animalistic hunger slowly began to drown out the last remnants of my human reason. I fought. I desperately, with my last strength, clung to my fading humanity, to fragments of memories of my past life, of my military service, of our small but close-knit team. But the insidious, pervasive infection was too strong. Alaya looked at me with unconcealed horror and deep, genuine compassion. She knew perfectly well what was happening to me. She faced the same terrible, unbearable choice that we had once faced with Ben: to help me preserve the last pitiful remnants of human dignity, to quickly and mercifully kill me before I irrevocably turned into a mindless, bloodthirsty monster, or to try to save herself, leaving me here to a certain agonizing death. "Go, Alaya, go quickly," I rasped, overcoming with immense effort the unbearable pain and the rising, guttural, bestial growl that was already tearing from my chest. "Save yourself. Don't let this vile creature get another monster." But she didn't leave. Instead, she slowly, heavily approached me, her exhausted face contorted in a grimace of unbearable suffering. "I won't leave you here alone, Ethan. We'll either get out of this hell together or—" She didn't finish. Instead, she carefully but firmly helped me to my feet, gently draping my healthy, uninjured arm over her fragile shoulder. Every single step, even the slightest, sent agonizing, piercing pain through my body, but we moved forward. Where? We didn't know ourselves. We just walked away from this cursed, God-forsaken place. We trudged with our last strength through the dense, hostile forest, like two living ghosts, balancing on the very edge between life and death, between despair and madness. My mind was already very clouded. My consciousness would briefly clear, then again plunge into the viscous, bloody fog of the relentlessly approaching transformation. I physically felt my body changing irreversibly, how my fingers unnaturally lengthened and sharpened, how my skin thickened and became covered with rough bristles. Alaya, barely standing herself from significant blood loss and extreme physical exhaustion, dragged me along with her last strength, loyally supporting me, not letting me finally fall and give up. She spoke incessantly, trying to encourage me, but her words reached my clouded consciousness, as if through a thick layer of cotton wool, indistinctly and meaninglessly. I don't know how long we walked. An hour, 2, or perhaps an eternity. At some point, I suddenly heard a strange, unfamiliar sound, completely unlike the usual, accustomed sounds of the night forest. It was the distinct sound of a running car engine. Alaya stopped abruptly, listening intently. And then, through the thick veil of fog and the dense curtain of trees, we finally saw it. The bright, intermittent, life-saving flashing light of a police car. We had miraculously reached a road. Alaya desperately, with her last strength, screamed, waving her hand. The police car braked sharply. 2 armed police officers hastily emerged, their faces expressing extreme shock and utter bewilderment at the sight of 2 bloodied, ragged, half-mad human figures, one of whom already bore very little resemblance to an ordinary person. I vaguely remember their frightened, wide eyes filled with horror, their clipped, anxious shouts over the radio. Then other police cars appeared from somewhere, people in white medical gowns. We were immediately roughly separated, I desperately growling and trying to break free with my last strength, was quickly restrained and injected with some potent sedative. Consciousness definitively, irrevocably left me. The last thing I managed to see before finally plunging into the saving, impenetrable darkness was Alaya's face, contorted with horror and immense despair, as I was forcibly taken away in an unknown direction, and the blood-red, ominous peaks of Red Peak against the slowly rising crimson sun. The mountains that morning truly seemed bathed in fresh, uncongealed blood. I had lost my last decisive battle. The ancient, merciless curse of Red Peak had finally caught up with me. I woke up not in a regular hospital room, as one might expect, but in some strange, sterile, completely isolated room. Its walls were entirely padded with some soft, resilient white material, and the bright, relentless light of fluorescent lamps mercilessly stung my eyes, making them water. I found myself securely strapped to a hard metal cot with wide, strong leather straps. My entire body ached unbearably. My head throbbed with a dull, pulsating pain. But the monstrous, irreversible transformation seemed to have miraculously stopped, or at least significantly slowed down. I felt incredibly weak, utterly shattered and empty. But I was still myself. Although somewhere very deep inside, in the most hidden corners of my soul, a primal, animalistic hunger and blind, irrational rage still smoldered, ready to erupt at any moment and consume the remnants of my human consciousness. Then some people in bulky, sealed protective suits appeared, very similar to those usually worn when dealing with particularly dangerous biological or chemical substances. They silently, methodically took blood samples, tissue samples and meticulously scanned my body with some complex, incomprehensible medical equipment. They tried to ask me questions, but I either stubbornly remained silent or answered with a guttural, deep growl. I had no idea where Alaya was now, what had become of her after our rescue. And this uncertainty worried and tormented me far more than my own unenviable fate. Alaya, as I learned much later, was placed in a regular county hospital, but under strict round-the-clock police guard. Her numerous wounds were carefully treated and bandaged, but her rambling, frightening accounts of bloodthirsty skinwalkers, of the ancient, sinister curse of these lands, of what I was rapidly becoming before her eyes, aroused only deep distrust and serious suspicion of her sanity from the local authorities. Officials, first detectives from the local police department, then joined by representatives of the National Park Service, and then some grim, taciturn types in strict, impeccable civilian suits, introducing themselves as employees of a federal emergency investigation agency, interrogated her for many hours, straight day and night. They persistently tried to attribute everything that had happened to a sudden attack by a pack of rabid wolves, or an exceptionally large, aggressive rogue bear, to severe post-traumatic stress disorder, to vivid hallucinations caused by her injuries, overexertion, and oxygen deprivation. But Alaya stood firm, unwavering, describing in minute detail again and again all the horrors we had endured in the cursed Red Peak Forest. A few days after our so-called rescue, the mysterious men in black unexpectedly appeared in Alaya's hospital room. They looked nothing like ordinary doctors or law enforcement officers. Expensive, perfectly fitting sharp suits, absolutely impenetrable, emotionless faces, cold, attentive, tenacious gazes. They introduced themselves as members of a special classified group for the urgent study of anomalous biological threats, something like the Army's USAM-RID, but with much broader, almost unlimited, and completely secret powers. They immediately and completely isolated Alaya from other patients and medical staff, conducted their own, much more detailed and in-depth medical examinations, took all her clothes and the few personal belongings she still had after our ill-fated trek. They also confiscated my miraculously surviving field journal with detailed notes, which Alaya had carefully kept all this time, and Gus's old, worn Indian amulet along with his handmade map. Everything disappeared without a trace, as if none of it had ever existed. As for me, I was apparently not deemed utterly hopeless or beyond further in-depth study. Instead of being quickly and quietly removed, as the late Gus once put it, I was secretly transferred under heavy guard to some deeply classified, state-of-the-art research laboratory, located God knows where, possibly even underground. Here, I was continuously subjected to painful, humiliating experiments, desperately trying to understand the true nature of this terrible supernatural infection to find some effective antidote, or, what seemed much more likely to me, to develop a way to use this ancient, powerful curse for their own military or other equally nefarious purposes. I had become just a guinea pig to them, an anonymous object number whatever. My humanity slowly but inexorably faded with each passing day, but I fought desperately, clinging with my last strength to the remnants of my former self, to bright memories of Alaya, of Ben, of old grumpy but so kind Gus. Alaya, after several long, grueling weeks of continuous intensive interrogations, harsh psychological processing, and signing a pile of various papers about complete and unconditional non-disclosure of the information received, was finally released. Officially, she was given the vague diagnosis of acute post-traumatic stress disorder, and strongly recommended long-term comprehensive psychiatric treatment. Her deep shoulder wound gradually healed, but the results of numerous tests, she was told, fortunately showed no signs of infection. Perhaps the dose of venom she received was too small, or her strong constitution, hardened by decades of difficult life in the harsh wilderness, somehow miraculously managed to fight off this terrible infection. But deep, unhealing psychological scars remained with her forever. She desperately tried to return to her former normal life, but it proved utterly impossible. Nightmarish, vivid, intrusive dreams of Red Peak, of the bloodthirsty skinwalkers, of my horrible, irreversible transformation haunted her every night, giving her no peace. She could no longer look at the forest as she once had. The ancient, almost mystical connection to nature that she had so highly valued and preserved all her life was irrevocably, brutally severed. Now, in every dark, overgrown corner of the forest, in every unsettling rustle of autumn leaves in the wind, she saw a hidden, deadly threat. A short, sparse, almost unnoticeable note soon appeared in local newspapers about a tragic incident that had recently occurred in Red Peak National Park. It vaguely spoke of a sudden attack by a pack of unknown, particularly aggressive animals, possibly rabid wolves or a rogue bear, on a group of rangers and one tourist. It reported several fatalities and one woman who miraculously survived. The park was immediately, without further explanation, closed indefinitely for public safety reasons and for complex ecological studies and subsequent rehabilitation of the area. The entire truth about these terrible events was securely buried under a thick layer of bureaucratic lies and a top-secret classification. But Alaya did not accept such blatant injustice. Her numerous, desperate attempts to tell the truth to independent journalists or alternative researchers of anomalous phenomena invariably met with a deaf wall of bureaucratic indifference, outright disbelief, and sarcastic ridicule. She was persistently deemed a mad, traumatized woman making up absurd, improbable tall tales. But she did not give up. Using her modest personal savings and the few useful connections she still had, she began her own secret, dangerous investigation. She persistently sought any information about other similar, inexplicable cases in remote, rarely visited national parks across the country, tried to find other survivors of similar incidents, to understand the true, deep nature of this ancient, merciless skinwalker curse, to find some, however faint, way to effectively fight this primordial evil. And perhaps one day, if she was very lucky, to find out what truly became of me, Ethan Riley.